My son-in-law never suspected that I owned the very company where he served as CEO. To him, I was just a quiet old man in a worn corduroy jacket who kept to himself. Then one evening he invited me to a private dinner with his well-heeled parents. I said yes, I wanted to watch how people like that behave when they think you have nothing. They showed their true colors the moment they slid a fat white envelope across the mahogany table, offering to pay me to vanish from my own daughter's life. Welcome back to Family Revenge Stories. I'm glad you're here with me today. If this channel has found its way to you, go ahead and subscribe so the next story comes straight to you, without any searching. Before we begin, have you ever had someone in your life look right through you, as though you were invisible, because they assumed you had nothing worth respecting? Drop a yes or a no in the comments. I'd genuinely like to know. One more thing before we start: some elements of this story have been shaped for the purpose of audio storytelling, and any resemblance to specific real people or events is entirely coincidental. It's the truth at the heart of it that matters. I glanced down at my worn work boots, polished with care, clean but unmistakably marked by decades of hard use. I'd worn those boots for 15 years. With a single phone call, I could have bought out the entire restaurant, yet I chose the boots. I chose the worn corduroy jacket. I chose to show up in a rusted flatbed truck, which I left parked 3 blocks away to avoid the valet staff. I am 69 years old, and I learned early that real wealth is a quiet shield, while showing it off is a loud target. My name is Gerald Calloway, and my life has been shaped by two things: the logistics empire I built from nothing, and my daughter Nora. Nora was the reason I was standing out in the bitter cold. She had married Derek 3 years ago. From the very start, I could see right through Derek. There was a calculated hunger in his eyes, the way he sized a man up by the brand on his watch or the cut of his suit. He treated me with a thinly veiled contempt, the exhausting tolerance a person reserves for someone they consider a social liability. He was convinced I was a retired blue-collar worker scraping by on a meager state pension. He believed my small 2-bedroom suburban house represented the outer boundary of everything I'd ever accomplished. I never set him straight. I wanted Nora to be loved for who she was not, for the enormous trust fund sitting quietly in her name. When Derek told me his parents, Roland and Celeste, were flying in to celebrate his recent promotion to CEO of Apex Innovations, he extended an invitation to dinner. It arrived with a heavy sigh, a clear obligation dressed up as courtesy. I accepted because I needed to understand exactly what kind of family my daughter had married into. I pushed through the heavy brass doors of the restaurant. The lobby's warmth rolled over me, rich with roasted garlic, seared steak, and expensive perfume. A hostess with a fixed smile looked me over her eyes, pausing on the frayed elbows of my jacket. I gave her Derek's name, and her polished smile tightened as she steered me through the crowded dining room and toward the private suites at the back. The heavy oak doors stood slightly ajar. I stepped into the private room. The conflict started before a single word was exchanged. Roland and Celeste occupied the center of the long table. They looked precisely as I'd pictured. Roland wore a custom-tailored charcoal suit, a massive gold watch catching the light on his wrist like a weapon of intimidation. Celeste was draped in a silk dress heavy with pearls, her expression pulled tight with judgment. Derek sat beside them, slowly swirling a glass of deep red wine. When I entered, not one of them rose. Roland and Celeste raked their eyes across my clothes, and the disdain that followed was immediate and total. Derek didn't offer his hand. He simply gestured with his wineglass toward the chair at the far end of the table, as much distance from them as the room would allow. Nora was nowhere to be seen. Derek muttered that she'd slipped out to the restroom to fix her makeup. I pulled out my own chair and settled into the heavy, suffocating quiet. The psychological assault began the moment the waiter filled the water glasses. Celeste leaned in, resting her diamond-ringed fingers on the white tablecloth. She looked at me with a smile that oozed condescending pity. She asked how my little house was holding up through the winter, stressing the word little, as though she were describing a doghouse. Then she lamented how grueling it was to heat their sprawling estate in Cape May. Roland joined in, loudly boasting about their recent 3-week vacation on the Amalfi Coast. He swirled his wine and let his eyes drop pointedly to my worn work boots. He asked what exactly I had done for a living before retiring to my quiet, unremarkable life. I held his gaze and kept my voice low and steady. I told him I'd worked with my hands my whole life, spent decades managing freight, hauling boxes, dealing with trucks. That was the absolute truth. I simply left out the part where I eventually owned 10,000 of those trucks. Roland let out a short, mocking laugh. He shot Celeste a glance of pure superiority. They'd already filed me away as an uneducated warehouse hand. Derek shifted in his chair, his face flushing with deep embarrassment. He looked at me as though my very presence was a stain on his freshly minted corporate image. The air in the room thickened into something close to toxic. Every remark Celeste made about fine dining luxury cars and high society connections was a calculated insult, each one aimed at establishing total dominance. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't defend myself. I sat quietly, nursing my tap water, watching their arrogance with the cold, patient detachment of a predator observing prey walk straight into a trap. The waiter returned with expensive cuts of meat and towering seafood platters. Roland didn't touch his food. Instead, he reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket and produced a thick, crisp white envelope, which he set squarely on the mahogany table. He pressed 2 fingers to it and slid it slowly across the polished surface until it came to rest directly in front of my plate. The room went deathly silent. Derek stared at his plate, refusing to meet my eyes. Celeste lifted her wine glass in a slow, deliberate sip, watching me over the rim with a predatory smirk. I looked down at the envelope, then back up at Roland. I asked what was inside. Roland spoke with brutal, unapologetic bluntness. There was a cashier's check for $20,000 in that envelope, he said. A relocation fund. The terms were absolute and non-negotiable. I was to invent some excuse: declining health, a craving for warmer weather, pack up my pathetic little house, and move to some lower-tier retirement facility in Florida or Arizona. I was to remove myself entirely from Nora and Derek's lives. My heart beat out a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I asked him why on earth I would do any such thing. Roland leaned forward, voice dripping with venom. He announced that Derek had just been appointed Chief Executive Officer of Apex Innovations. He declared that Derek was now moving in circles of extreme wealth and influence. He looked at my worn corduroy jacket with naked disgust. He told me that my visible poverty, my lack of education, and my lower-class background were social anchors dragging down Derek's rising trajectory. He said that a man of Derek's stature could not afford to be seen alongside someone who looked as if he belonged in a soup kitchen. I didn't touch the envelope. I turned my gaze slowly toward Derek, the boy I had allowed to marry my only daughter, the man who had taken vows to honor and respect our family. I asked Derek directly whether he agreed with his father. I asked whether he truly wanted me to pocket this money and disappear from his daughter's life. Derek finally raised his head. He looked me square in the eye, his face hardened by greed and unchecked ambition. He agreed with his parents without flinching. Derek stated that his career required a certain image. He told me that a corporate executive running a company as large as Apex Innovations simply could not have a father-in-law who looked like a janitor. He told me to take the money and do what was best for everyone. The betrayal hung there in the air, vile and suffocating. Derek had sold his soul to his own vanity, completely and without reservation. He had no idea that the massive company he was so proud to run, the corporate empire that fed his disgusting sense of superiority, had been built by the very hands he was insulting. He had no idea that the board of directors who had hired him ultimately answered to a blind trust controlled entirely by the man sitting across from him in a frayed corduroy jacket. At that exact moment, the heavy oak door clicked open. Nora walked back into the private dining room, her face bright and completely unaware of the execution that had just taken place. She smiled at me, wondering aloud whether they'd already ordered the appetizers. Before anyone else could speak, I reached out and smoothly slid the white envelope into the inner pocket of my jacket. The atmosphere in the room shifted in an instant. Roland and Celeste exchanged a fast, victorious glance. Derek let out a quiet, barely audible exhale of relief. They were certain I had surrendered. They believed the poor, pathetic old man had taken the money out of sheer desperation. I looked at my daughter, my beautiful, generous Nora, who deserved so much more than the cowards seated at this table. I didn't scream. I didn't overturn the table or make a public spectacle of myself. Anger is an emotion for people without power, and every last bit of the power in that room belonged to me. I rose slowly, keeping my movements deliberate and calm. I reached into my pants pocket and came out with a single crumpled $1 bill. I smoothed it flat between my fingers and set it precisely in the center of my empty plate. I looked Derek straight in the eye and told him that dollar was there to cover the cost of my tap water. Then I turned to Nora and forced a gentle smile onto my face. I told her I'd come over suddenly. Unwell, the winter air had brought on a headache, and that I needed to head home and rest. Nora's face fell with concern. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around me, offering to skip the rest of dinner and drive me home herself. I kissed her forehead and told her to stay and enjoy the evening with her new family. I'd call her in the morning, I promised. As I pulled away from my daughter, I caught one last look at Roland. He was smirking, sawing into his expensive steak with the deep satisfaction of a man who believed he'd just purchased the world. I turned my back on all of them and walked out of the private room. I moved through the crowded restaurant, the sounds of clinking crystal and moneyed laughter receding behind me. I pushed through the brass doors and stepped out into the freezing Philadelphia night. The bitter wind cut across my face, but I didn't feel the cold. The meek, quiet old man I'd been performing for the past 2 hours evaporated on the spot. My spine straightened. My eyes sharpened into the darkness of the street. I reached into my pocket, past the envelope stuffed with Roland's filthy money, and pulled out my cell phone. I scrolled to a secure number and placed the call. It rang exactly once before someone picked up. Malcolm, my corporate attorney and the architect of my blind trust, spoke quietly on the other end of the line. I didn't bother with a greeting. I spoke with the full, terrifying authority of a man declaring war. I told Malcolm they had taken the bait. I told him my son-in-law had crossed the point of no return. I ordered Malcolm to launch an immediate, ruthless forensic audit of Derek's executive accounts at Apex Innovations, every single dime Derek had touched since the board put him in that chair. I stood in the shadows of the street, watching the valet pull a black Mercedes up to the restaurant entrance, and I already knew exactly how this story was going to end. The hunt had officially begun, and I intended to tear their fraudulent little kingdom straight down to the foundation. The freezing Philadelphia wind battered my windshield as I drove my rusted flatbed truck into the underground parking garage of a towering glass skyscraper in the financial district. I skipped the visitor section entirely and pulled into a secured space that had been held in my name for more than 2 decades. The armed guard posted by the private executive elevator didn't ask for identification. He simply nodded with quiet respect and pressed his thumb to the biometric wall scanner. The heavy steel doors slid apart, carrying me up to the 47th floor. I left the poor, pathetic old man down in the cold streets where he belonged. By the time the elevator chimed, my posture had locked straight, and my gaze had hardened to stone. I was exactly who I needed to be. The doors opened onto a vast, dimly lit office, the glittering city skyline spread out below the windows. Malcolm stood waiting beside a long mahogany conference table. He had been my lead corporate attorney for 30 solid years, a man whose absolute loyalty was matched only by his terrifying effectiveness in a boardroom. He offered no polite greeting. He didn't ask how dinner with my daughter and her in-laws had gone. He already knew why I was standing there. He simply pushed a stack of thick, leather-bound corporate files across the polished table. I shrugged off my worn corduroy jacket, draped it over the back of a leather chair, and sat down. I laid my hands flat on the table and felt the full, immense weight of my life pressing up through the wood beneath my palms. I stared at the gold-embossed logo on the top file, Apex Innovations. Derek loved tossing that corporate name around as though he'd dragged the company up from the earth with his own hands. He wielded his title of Chief Executive Officer to intimidate waiters, impress his arrogant parents, and belittle me. He had no earthly idea what it actually took to build something like this. I built this company from nothing but dust and sheer desperation. 30 years ago, my wife Elaine passed away unexpectedly. I was left utterly alone in a dark world, a grieving toddler at my side and a crushing mountain of medical debt overhead. I took the last few dollars I had and bought a single broken-down delivery truck at a local police auction. I worked 20 hours a day hauling heavy freight through freezing sleet and blistering summer heat with little Nora asleep in a makeshift bed across the passenger seat because I couldn't afford basic childcare. I skipped meals so she could eat. Every dollar I earned went straight back into the business. One struggling truck became a fleet of 10. 10 became 100. And eventually, that desperate, grinding hustle became an international logistics network worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Apex Innovations was my blood, my sweat, and my absolute refusal to leave my daughter without a safe world to stand in. 10 years ago, I accepted that my body could no longer sustain the punishing pace of corporate life. Our financial future was locked in permanently. I chose to step away from the public eye entirely to tend my small, suburban garden, live quietly, and watch Nora grow into the fiercely independent woman she'd become. I directed Malcolm to draw up the paperwork, placing my 70% majority ownership of Apex Innovations into a highly secure, irrevocable blind trust. I named Malcolm as the primary executive and wiped my personal name from the public corporate registry. As far as the outside business world was concerned, the founder had drifted away into a peaceful, anonymous retirement. The executive board managed daily operations without any awareness of who their silent owner was or how he spent his days. 2 years ago, that same board of directors hired a rising corporate star named Derek to step in as chief executive officer, chosen purely on the strength of an aggressive resume and the ability to fill out a sharp suit. Derek walked into that massive corner office convinced he'd conquered the business world on pure merit alone. When he married my daughter, he looked at my worn work boots, my plain clothes, and my modest suburban house, and filed me away as an uneducated failure without a second thought. He had absolutely no idea that the corporation bankrolling his luxury cars, his tailored suits, and his insufferable pride belonged entirely to the quiet old man he was trying so hard to erase from his life. He was certain he was the undisputed king of the castle. He was a hired hand living inside a fortress I'd built with my own 2 hands. I looked up at Malcolm. He stood in silence across the table, waiting on my word. I reached into my shirt pocket and drew out the crisp white envelope holding the $20,000 bribe Derek and his parents had pressed on me barely an hour before. I tossed it onto the center of the table. I told Malcolm that my son-in-law had made a fatal, irreversible miscalculation. He had mistaken my chosen silence for weakness and my simple life for defeat. He'd tried to buy my disappearance to protect his precious corporate image. I told Malcolm it was time to show Derek exactly who owned and controlled that image. Then I leaned forward and gave the order. I instructed Malcolm to legally lift the blind trust veil without delay. I demanded my name be reinstated on the private executive registry immediately. I wanted full, unrestricted access at the highest level of corporate clearance. Malcolm gave a sharp nod, a cold smile forming at the corner of his mouth. He opened his secure laptop and typed a rapid sequence of commands that deactivated the decade-long shield of anonymity protecting my controlling shares. The system chimed softly. Gerald Calloway was officially back in absolute control of the board. The sleeping giant had been rudely awakened by a fool who thought he was throwing stones at a ghost. The corporate wall that had kept my personal life separate from my business empire was now rubble. But exposing my identity was only the opening move. I wasn't simply going to fire Derek. I needed to know exactly what he'd been doing behind my desk. I told Malcolm to prepare the accounting team. We were going to open the books. I reached into the inner pocket of my worn corduroy jacket and pulled out the crisp white envelope once more. I set it down on the polished mahogany table directly in front of Malcolm. The soft thud of the paper seemed to carry in the stillness of the office. I told him to open it. He reached forward with practiced hands and drew the cashier's check free from the unsealed flap. He studied the $20,000 figure, then raised his eyes to mine with a silent question. I told him that was the exact price my son-in-law had placed on my dignity, $20,000. That was the figure Derek and his parents had decided was fair compensation for erasing me from my own daughter's life, a check to pack me off to some cut-rate retirement home and scrub me clean from their polished corporate story. Malcolm set it on the table. His jaw tightened, his whole face going cold and hard, the way it does when he is about to go to war on my behalf. He understood what Apex Innovations had cost me to build. He'd watched me sacrifice all those years ago going hungry, bedding down in a frozen delivery cab so Nora could sleep somewhere warm and safe. I pushed forward in my chair and laid out what came next. Firing Derek was nowhere near enough. I wanted his whole world reduced to rubble. I gave Malcolm the order to tear open every executive account Derek had put his hands on from the day the board crowned him chief executive officer. Every line, every figure, every dollar. What this had been was a private humiliation over expensive steaks and cheap wine. What it was now was something else entirely. Corporate warfare declared and unambiguous. Malcolm moved without hesitation. Before an hour had passed, the boardroom had been converted into something closer to a war room. He pulled in a crew of forensic accountants, specialists, the kind who are brought in specifically to unravel financial crimes that ordinary auditors would never find. Independent of Apex Innovations, entirely the best Philadelphia had to offer. I settled at the head of the table, black coffee going cold in my hand, while their encrypted machines came to life around me. I handed over Derek's executive authorization codes, the same codes I had quietly approved through the blind trust, and told them what I was after: concealed transactions, unauthorized bonuses, expense reports, buried where no one would look without a reason to dig. I wanted them to strip back the surface of Derek's comfortable, glittering life and show me what was crawling underneath. They worked without a word between them. The only noise in that room was keyboards, fast-focused, unrelenting. Numbers filled the wall monitor in long columns, years of corporate history, unspooling like thread pulled from a spool. 48 hours. I scarcely moved from that chair. I sat and watched them take apart what I had assembled over a lifetime. I thought about the early years, me at my kitchen table with a paper ledger, checking every line twice, making certain every driver got what he was owed, every vendor got paid on schedule. That was the standard I had held. My handshake meant something. I never took a single cent that did not belong to me. And now Derek's name sat at the top of those same accounts, like a brand burned into something I'd built from nothing. He was warming my chair, running my company as a personal expense account. Near the end of the second night, Petra, the lead accountant, sharp-eyed and completely without sentiment, went still. She glanced at Malcolm, then swiveled her screen so I could see it. What they had found, she said, was not a rounding error or a misclassified travel budget. It was something deliberate, something enormous. She walked me through it, a layered maze of financial transfers methodically constructed over the course of 18 months. Derek had been routing money around the board's oversight committee the entire time. Strip away the expensive suits and the boardroom swagger, and what you had underneath was a criminal precise, patient calculating. He had built a constellation of shell companies, each one registered to a fictitious vendor, each one receiving payment for work that had never once been performed. Millions upon millions were draining out of Apex Innovations' treasury in a slow, deliberate hemorrhage landing in accounts that existed only to receive stolen money. I sat with the numbers in front of me and felt the full weight of what I was seeing. The scale of it was obscene. He was cannibalizing the company I had poured my life into stripping it down to feed his own appetite. The man who had sneered at my clothes across a dinner table. The man who had suggested I looked like I belonged in a charity line. He was a thief. Nothing more distinguished than a parasite draining a host he hadn't built and couldn't understand. The accountants dug further. Every shell company led to private offshore accounts sitting under Derek's sole control. Every security layer I had engineered before stepping back a decade ago had been quietly dismantled. He had forged sign-offs from department heads who had no idea what they were approving. The profit reports sent to the board each quarter were works of fiction constructed to cover the gaps while he hollowed out the treasury beneath them. The board believed him because he was convincing. He had perfected the art of selling a story of growth while gutting the reality behind it. A cold fury settled into my chest. He was reaching into Nora's future and taking from it. He was reaching into the pockets of every warehouse worker, every driver, every dispatcher who showed up every day, trusting that their jobs were real and secure. I turned to Malcolm. The case was already made: transaction records, forged authorizations, offshore account numbers. Derek had walked himself into federal criminal exposure. Embezzlement at this scale carried decades, not years. Malcolm put the question to me, Plainly, did I want the authorities brought in tonight? Derek could be in handcuffs at his desk before sunrise. I let a moment pass, then shook my head. A quiet arrest behind closed doors was not justice. It was a favor. Derek and his family had staged a public performance. They had sat across a restaurant table and tried to write me out of my daughter's life for $20,000. They thought nothing, and no one could touch them. A clean private prosecution was letting them off easy, slipping them out a side door before anyone noticed the fire. That was not what I had in mind. I wanted Derek exposed the same way he had tried to expose me in full view, with nowhere to retreat. I instructed Malcolm to document everything, every stolen dollar, cataloged every thread of evidence secured. We would move, but we would move on my timeline. Then Petra's voice cut through the room. She had pulled up a memo Derek had just circulated internally to the board. He wasn't waiting. He was already setting up his next move, something aggressive enough to let him sever the blind trust's grip on the company entirely. We were no longer operating at a comfortable pace. Petra worked quickly, tracing the money past the offshore layer we had already mapped. Those accounts were not the end point. They were a passage, a smokescreen built to misdirect anyone following the trail. She surfaced a fresh set of encrypted banking records and put them on the room's main display. I got up and stood close to the screen. What I was looking at was no longer an abstraction about corporate theft. This was targeted, personal. Derek had not parked the money in the Cayman Islands waiting for some rainy day departure. He was cycling it back on shore through a labyrinth of fabricated consulting arrangements, phantom marketing contracts, and anonymous family trusts, and the designated beneficiaries of those trusts were Roland and Celeste. The financial statements glowed in the darkened room. Everything clicked into place at once, and the picture that formed was ugly and absolute. The lavish life Roland had dangled in my face at dinner, the exotic travel, the gleaming cars, the jewelry, none of it came from sound investments or decades of honest industry. It was theater, every bit of it bankrolled by money that had been drained from my company. Petra navigated to the expenditure reports attached to the family trust. There were the receipts for the 3-week trip along the Amalfi coast Roland had crowed about over his steak. There were the invoices for the tailored suits, the monogrammed luggage, the diamond pieces Celeste stacked on herself like she'd earned them. There were the wire records for 2 imported luxury vehicles, both registered to Roland, both settled in full, with funds rerouted from an Apex Innovations shipping account. Then Petra opened the largest file in the audit. 2 weeks prior, Derek had transferred $4 million directly out of an Apex Innovations emergency reserve and into Celeste's private holding company. That money had moved immediately into the purchase of a brand new 80-foot yacht, now sitting in a slip at a premier marina in Miami. I steadied my breathing. The audacity of it sat on my chest like something physical. I found myself back at that restaurant table in my mind, the white envelope pushed across the mahogany toward me, Derek and his parents watching with satisfied eyes. $20,000 to disappear? They called me a drag on their image, a man of no standing. And the exquisite damning irony, every dollar behind their contempt had been taken from the treasury I had built with my own 2 hands. They had tried to erase me using my own money as the weapon. Something hot and volcanic moved through me, pressing hard against the composure I had kept locked in place all evening. My mind went back to the grinding early years of building Apex Innovations. I remembered gathering my first dozen drivers in a freezing warehouse and making them a promise fair wages and a pension fund carved out of our very first profits so their families would never know the kind of desperate hunger I had grown up with. I held that corporate treasury as something close to sacred because every dollar in it stood for the security of thousands of people who showed up and did honest work. Derek was raiding that treasury like a personal expense account, buying yachts for 2 entitled parasites who had never broken a sweat in their comfortable lives. I shut my eyes and forced the heat of that anger back down where I needed it. Rage makes a man sloppy, and a single tactical error was something I could not afford. I let the fury cool until it was something harder and colder, dense and unbreakable, a weight I could carry without losing my footing. Firing my son-in-law was no longer the point. It would have been an act of generosity. A quiet dismissal and a discreet prosecution would give his parents time to shelter the stolen assets, cry poverty, and cast themselves as victims of a wayward son. That was not the outcome I had in mind. I wanted their entire constructed world brought down around them. I wanted Roland and Celeste to experience the same helplessness, the same financial nakedness, and the same public disgrace they had tried to engineer for me. I turned back to Malcolm. He stood reading the cold resolve settling over my face without needing a word of explanation. I told him this had moved well past a standard executive termination. We were invoking federal racketeering statutes. I directed Malcolm to trace every physical asset Roland and Celeste had acquired over the past 18 months: vehicles, jewelry, vacation properties, the yacht. When federal authorities finally moved, I wanted the net to drop over the entire family in one motion. Roland and Celeste were not bewildered bystanders blindsided by their son's sudden affluence. The financial records proved they were active accomplices, knowingly drawing stolen corporate capital through fraudulent consulting firms registered under their own names. Malcolm gave a sharp nod, a predatory gleam taking hold in his eyes. He began pulling the necessary legal instruments to freeze civilian assets tied to the corporate fraud. I told him to build the guillotine with absolute precision. We were not going to act tonight. We were going to let Derek proceed with his grand corporate merger gala this weekend. We were going to let him stand beneath bright lights in front of Philadelphia's moneyed elite, convinced the pathetic old father-in-law had been swept off the board. We were going to let Roland and Celeste drape themselves in their stolen diamonds, sip their expensive champagne, and soak up the admiration of whatever counterfeit social circle they had assembled. I wanted them at the very peak of their false confidence, because the higher they climbed on that platform of lies, the more total the collapse would be when it came. Petra handed me a printed summary of the stolen funds and the linked family accounts. I folded it carefully and slid it into my shirt pocket, right beside the $20,000 cashier's check Roland had placed in front of me at the restaurant. Two pieces of paper resting together against my chest, the complete timeline of what was coming for all of them. I thanked the accounting team for their work. I told them to secure the files, lock down the encrypted servers, and say nothing to anyone until I gave the word. I lifted my worn corduroy jacket from the back of the leather chair and walked toward the private executive elevator. Outside dawn was pushing up over the Philadelphia skyline, throwing cold, pale light across a city that was not yet awake. Derek thought he had outmaneuvered a foolish, ignorant old man. He believed his authority was total. He was about to learn what happens when you try to rob the man who designed every wall of the fortress you were standing in. I stepped into the elevator, already mapping the sequence of events for the gala. The trap was in place. The evidence was secured. The outcome was not in question. The heavy sound of a car door closing echoed down my quiet suburban street. I was on one knee in the front yard pressing fresh soil around a row of newly planted black-eyed Susans. My hands were dark with earth, a reminder the kind I still needed sometimes of where I came from and what had always kept me grounded. I heard the sharp, impatient snap of expensive leather shoes moving up my concrete driveway. I didn't need to raise my eyes to know who was standing there. Derek threw a long shadow across my garden. He was dressed in a tailored silver suit, surveying my modest, single-story home with the expression of a man who has just found mold on his dinner plate. No greeting, no pretense of courtesy. He simply announced that we needed to go inside, adding that the look of the neighborhood was offensive to him. I rose slowly, cleaned my hands on an old rag, and led him into the house where I had raised his wife 30 years ago. He crossed the threshold without touching the welcome mat, a small act of contempt, deliberate enough to be a statement. His eyes moved over the faded floral sofa, the worn brick fireplace, the photographs of Nora's childhood lined up along the mantel. He didn't bother hiding his disdain. To him, my entire life was evidence of failure. He dropped a thick leather briefcase onto my wooden coffee table and snapped the gold clasps open with unnecessary force. A stack of densely typed legal documents landed in front of me. He told me to sit down and read them. I stayed on my feet. I looked at the papers, then I looked at the man who apparently believed a borrowed title made him sovereign in someone else's home. Derek told me the $20,000 his father had offered at the restaurant was only the opening terms of our arrangement. He had decided to make my removal from his life a formal, legal matter. He jabbed a manicured finger at the top page and tapped the paper like a man accustomed to compliance. What he had drawn up, he explained, was an ironclad non-disclosure agreement, bound together with a total renunciation of rights. I was to legally swear I would never speak of the financial bribe his parents had delivered, and I was to formally surrender any future claim to Nora's financial support. He wanted me gagged and impoverished in writing permanently. I asked what would happen if I chose not to sign. Derek moved closer, crowding my space, his voice dropping to a hard, quiet threat. He said he would cut me off from my daughter entirely. He controlled their joint finances, their living situation, everything that shaped her daily life, and he would use all of it to ensure I never saw Nora or any future grandchildren again if I pushed back. He spoke about my daughter not the way a man speaks about someone he loves, but the way a man speaks about an asset he has secured. He was using my own child as leverage to protect a lie. He was holding my family hostage to prop up a fraudulent image. I looked down at the document on my coffee table. I read the clauses reducing me to a financial irrelevance, mapping out my enforced isolation in careful legal language. A younger version of myself, the man who hauled freight through blizzards and built something from absolutely nothing, might have ended the conversation differently and permanently. I had broken harder men than Derek over far smaller provocations, but patience had become the sharpest tool I owned, honed over decades until it cut deeper than anger ever could. My voice stayed level. My face gave him nothing. I walked into the kitchen, washed the garden soil from my hands, and dried them without hurrying. When I came back, I picked up a cheap plastic pen from the counter, leaned over the coffee table, and signed my name at the bottom of his extortion document. Slowly, deliberately, with a calm that I could see unsettled him, even through his arrogance. The second my pen left the page, Derek snatched the papers off the table. He stuffed them into his briefcase with the barely contained excitement of a man who had just won something. He had walked into my home and bent an old man to his will, or so the story he was telling himself went. He felt entirely untouchable in that moment. His certainty was total, and his blindness was just as complete. Because what he had actually done was hand me a signed witness document, proving he had attempted to extort the majority shareholder of his own company. He had put his blackmail in writing and signed it himself. Derek snapped his briefcase shut and moved toward the front door, his whole body broadcasting a victory he had not actually won. At the threshold, he stopped and turned back to deliver one final calculation. He announced that he was hosting a major corporate merger gala for Apex Innovations that coming weekend. He called it the crowning achievement of his entire career, a night of opulence and spectacle that would cement his standing as the most powerful chief executive in the city. He made it absolutely clear that I was not to come anywhere near that venue. My presence, he said, would be a mortifying disgrace to his distinguished guests. He warned me that hotel security would drag me out by the collar if I had the nerve to show my face and embarrass him in front of the board. I stood in the middle of my quiet, modest living room. I looked at the man who had looted millions from my company's treasury to finance his parents' yacht. The man who was now systematically tormenting my only child. I kept my voice perfectly level, stripped of any anger or fear. I told Derek that I understood his position entirely. I wished him a very successful evening at his grand affair. Derek sneered, muttered something vicious under his breath, and stormed out the door. I watched through the front window as his luxury car tore away down my street. He was convinced he had removed me from the board permanently. He had no idea I was already rewriting the rules of the entire game. The paperwork was signed. The trap was fully set, and the weekend was nearly upon us. The man who believed he had buried me was about to find out he'd been digging his own grave. The sun had barely gone below the horizon when heavy rain began hammering the roof of my small suburban home. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the extortion contract Derek had forced me to sign just hours before. I was working through the exact sequence of legal moves Malcolm would execute come Monday morning. The house around me was dead silent. Then urgent, frantic knocking rattled my front door. It wasn't the confident, arrogant pounding of my son-in-law. It was a desperate, panicked rhythm. I walked down the hall and pulled the door open. My daughter Nora stood on the porch, shivering in the freezing downpour. She had a thin coat over her clothes, completely soaked through her hair, pressed flat against her cheeks. The bright, fiercely independent woman I had raised looked utterly shattered. She didn't say a word. She simply fell into my chest, burying her face against my shoulder as a deep sob tore through her. I pulled her inside without hesitation, shutting the door against the cold night. I guided her into the kitchen, draped a thick wool blanket around her trembling shoulders, and put a cup of hot tea in front of her. I didn't ask what was wrong. I already knew exactly who had done this. I pulled up a chair across from her and waited while she caught her breath. Nora wrapped her shaking hands around the warm ceramic mug. She stared down at the scratched surface of my old kitchen table. She told me she had gone to the grocery store that afternoon. When she went to pay for a simple basket of food, her card was declined. She tried a second, then a third. Every single account with her name on it had been completely frozen. When she called Derek to ask whether there had been some kind of bank error, he didn't express concern. He erupted in a fury. He accused her of being financially reckless. He told her she was an irresponsible liability to his corporate image and that he had frozen the accounts to teach her a lesson in basic discipline. My hands curled into fists beneath the table. Derek was isolating her systematically. He was cutting off her money to strip away her independence and force her into total submission. But financial isolation was only the first phase of his strategy. Nora drew a shaking breath and told me the real reason she had run out into the storm. She said Derek had arrived home from work about an hour later with a stack of legal documents tucked under his arm. He had thrown them onto the kitchen island and demanded she sign them on the spot. They were a full transfer of assets. Derek wanted her to sign over the private inheritance fund her mother had left for her. Before I built my logistics empire, before the blind trusts and the offshore accounts, my late wife Elaine had received a small life insurance payout from her own parents. Elaine had set that money aside specifically for Nora. It was a modest, untouchable safety net put there to protect our daughter, if the world ever turned on her. Derek knew about that money. He told Nora he needed the inheritance capital to secure a bridge loan for a vast new estate they were supposedly purchasing in Cape May. He claimed it was a temporary transfer, a simple formality the bank required to process the mortgage. When Nora hesitated and asked to read the paperwork first, Derek turned terrifyingly cruel. He called her an ungrateful burden. He accused her of failing to trust his brilliance as a chief executive. He told her that if she didn't hand over the inheritance by tomorrow morning, their marriage was effectively finished. I sat in my kitchen staring at my heartbroken daughter as the final horrifying piece of Derek's grand strategy locked into place. Derek was not buying a house in Cape May. He was executing a total extraction. Malcolm's forensic audit had already proven that Derek was bleeding my company dry to fund his parents' fraudulent lifestyle and his own secret offshore accounts. Now the timeline snapped into focus. Derek knew the upcoming corporate merger gala would generate a massive wave of temporary capital. He intended to use the chaos of the merger to siphon the last remaining millions from the Apex Innovations treasury. Once the merger closed and those corporate funds were safely buried in his untraceable shell companies, he was going to disappear. He would take the company millions, take the yacht he had bought for Roland and Celeste, and walk away from his life in Philadelphia without looking back. But his greed was so absolute, so utterly consuming, that he couldn't leave a single dime on the table. He wanted Elaine's money too. He planned to strip my daughter of her last remaining safety net drain, her late mother's inheritance, into his offshore accounts and file for divorce, the moment his plane touched down in a country with no extradition treaty. He was going to throw Nora away like garbage, penniless, humiliated, and completely broken. A cold, lethal calm settled over me. I looked at the tears running down my daughter's face. Every instinct I had as a father told me to lay it all out for her, right there at that kitchen table. I wanted to tell her I owned the building Derek worked in. I wanted her to know I held his entire pathetic existence in the palm of my hand. I wanted to assure her that she was heir to an empire worth hundreds of millions, and that Derek was nothing but a dead man walking. But I held my tongue. Nora didn't need a corporate titan in that moment. She needed her father. She needed the quiet, steady man who had always made her feel safe. More than that, I needed Derek to feel completely, utterly invincible for just 48 more hours. If I revealed who I really was to Nora now, any shift in her demeanor might tip Derek off that the trap had been sprung. I needed him to walk out onto that brightly lit stage at the merger gala, believing he was the undisputed king of the world. I reached across the table and took Nora's trembling hands in mine. I looked straight into her tear-filled eyes. I told her in a voice that left absolutely no room for doubt that she was not going back to that house. I told her she would sleep in her old childhood bedroom tonight, and she would not answer a single call or message from her husband. I instructed her to ignore the bank accounts entirely, and under no circumstances to sign over her mother's inheritance. Nora looked up at me, her voice shaking, and asked what we were going to do. She was terrified of Derek's power, frightened by the enormous corporate shadow he threw over their lives. She believed he held every card. I wiped a tear from her cheek with my thumb. I didn't raise my voice. I spoke with the quiet, terrifying certainty of a man who had already won. I promised her that before this weekend was over, Derek would never be able to hurt her or anyone else again. I promised her the nightmare was already finished. She eased back into her chair and closed her eyes as a long, heavy breath left her lungs. She trusted me completely. She didn't ask how a retired laborer planned to take down a powerful chief executive. She simply knew her father had made a promise. I got up, cleared the teacups away, and walked her to her old room. I waited until I heard the soft, steady rhythm of her breathing and knew she had finally gone under. Then I went back to the kitchen and picked up my phone. The pain I had just seen in my daughter's eyes burned away every last trace of mercy I might have held for Derek or his arrogant parents. This was no longer a simple corporate cleanup. This was a reckoning profound and absolute. I called Malcolm's secure line and told him to accelerate the timeline. The trap was going to snap shut at the gala, and it was going to be the most spectacular takedown this city had ever witnessed. I left Nora sleeping safely in her childhood bed and drove into the heart of the financial district, before the sun had even crested the Philadelphia skyline. The city was still wrapped in cold pre-dawn gray. I walked into Malcolm's office. He was already there, waiting perfectly groomed, a fresh pot of coffee steaming on the glass desk. There was no time for pleasantries. We both understood the timeline had shifted. I dropped into the heavy leather chair across from him and told him it was time to bring the hammer down. I instructed Malcolm to invoke the full legal weight of my majority shareholding. I ordered an immediate and total executive freeze across every layer of Apex Innovations' corporate structure. Through my emergency shareholder privileges, I held the unilateral authority to lock the company's financial arteries completely. Malcolm drafted the mandate with ruthless precision. The document suspended all board-level transactional power. It froze every executive account. It stopped every outbound corporate wire transfer and left the Treasury entirely paralyzed. I picked up a heavy black pen and signed my name at the bottom. With that single signature, Derek was cut off from the company vault. He simply didn't know it yet. The reaction inside the Apex Innovations executive suite was immediate and beautifully chaotic. Malcolm monitored the internal corporate communications from his encrypted terminal. By 9 in the morning, the board of directors had descended into outright panic. For a decade, they had operated under the comfortable assumption that the anonymous founder was a silent, hands-off presence, perfectly happy collecting his annual dividends. Now the ghost had woken up, slammed his fist on the table, and locked everything down. Emails flew back and forth across the secure servers in a frenzied torrent. Vice presidents were rattled. No one could understand why the founder had initiated a hard freeze. Each department scrambled to audit its own books, convinced it was somehow the target of this sudden corporate fury. I didn't give them a moment to breathe. I ordered Malcolm to issue a second directive to the board, one far more terrifying than the first. As controlling shareholder, I formally demanded a mandatory disclosure meeting, but I did not schedule it for some ordinary Tuesday morning in a sterile conference room. I set it for Saturday night, right in the middle of the grand corporate merger gala Derek had so meticulously designed to celebrate his own manufactured brilliance. I instructed the legal department to mandate attendance from the entire executive board, chief executive officer included. Derek would be compelled to host the very meeting that would destroy him. Malcolm drafted the corporate summons with immaculate precision, ensuring my personal identity remained strictly shielded behind the ironclad protections of the blind trust. To Derek and the board, the notice came from one source, only the founder. The directive stated that the majority shareholder would step out of anonymity to personally address the executive team on the future of the company. It was an offer the board could not possibly refuse, and a command Derek had no legal grounds to ignore. He was bound by law to provide the stage for his own execution, but the corporate maneuvers were only half the battle. Terminating Derek was a straightforward business decision. Putting him in a federal penitentiary was a moral obligation. I watched Malcolm lift his secure landline and bypass local law enforcement entirely. He reached the lead investigator at the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Financial Crimes Division. Malcolm had spent the previous 48 hours assembling the forensic audit into a bulletproof federal dossier. He spoke quietly into the receiver, laying out the full devastation of Derek's crimes. He walked through the dummy shell companies. He listed the forged vendor invoices. He provided the exact routing numbers tracing millions of dollars systematically siphoned to purchase luxury yachts and European vacations for Roland and Celeste. The federal agents required no convincing. The paper trail we handed them was airtight and overwhelming. It drew a clear, damning portrait of a greedy executive who had been treating a multinational corporation as his own personal bank account. Malcolm coordinated the precise timing of the operation. The federal authorities agreed to position a tactical white-collar crime unit silently in the service corridors of the hotel throughout the gala. They would stay completely out of sight until the moment the trap was sprung. They would move the instant I laid the evidence bare on that stage. I stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of Malcolm's office and looked down at the financial district, humming below. Thousands of people were rushing to their jobs, entirely unaware of the invisible earthquake rolling through the bedrock of Apex Innovations. Derek was sitting in his massive corner office right now, probably admiring his own reflection in the glass, completely oblivious to the fact that his corporate credit cards had become worthless plastic. He believed he was a genius, orchestrating the perfect crime. He thought he could plunder my company, shatter my daughter's spirit, and throw $20,000 in my face to seal his flawless victory. He felt untouchable because he wore a designer suit and carried a fabricated title. He had no idea that real power has nothing to do with titles or tailored jackets. Real power is the ability to dismantle a man's entire world without ever raising your voice. The legal trap was locked, loaded, and primed to perfection. Every escape route had been methodically closed off. The federal agents were briefed, the board was rattled, and the stolen money was frozen. All that remained was waiting for Saturday night. The scent of cedar sawdust and motor oil has always given me a deep sense of peace. It was late Wednesday afternoon, and I was standing in the middle of aisle 4 at Renner and Sons Hardware. I had on my faded denim work jeans, worn work boots, and a thick canvas work shirt that had seen better decades. I was loading 50 lb bags of organic potting soil onto a heavy metal flatbed cart. My hands were calloused and dark with earth. I have always believed a man needs to keep his hands in the dirt to stay grounded in where he came from. Building Apex Innovations into a multinational powerhouse had meant years of custom-tailored suits and sterile glass boardrooms, but I never lost sight of the raw, honest labor that laid the foundation of everything I am. I hauled the 6th heavy bag onto the cart and felt the familiar, satisfying ache spread across my shoulders. I pushed the squeaking cart toward the front registers, settling into the quiet rhythm of a simple afternoon. The local hardware store was my sanctuary, a place where people respected hard work over empty words and hollow titles. I was at the checkout counter pulling my worn leather wallet from my pocket when a shrill, completely out-of-place voice cut through the calm of the store. I turned my head slowly. Roland and Celeste were standing just inside the automatic sliding doors. They looked absolutely ridiculous in that setting. Roland wore Roland's ivory merino turtleneck draped over his shoulders, paired with spotless tan loafers that had clearly never encountered a speck of real dirt. Celeste was wrapped in a tailored silk trench coat, clutching a designer handbag worth more than the cashier in front of me took home in 6 months. They were entirely out of their element. They had probably gotten turned around looking for some upscale garden boutique in the neighboring affluent suburb, and wandered in here by mistake. Roland spotted me almost immediately. His eyes traveled over my worn work boots, my thick canvas work shirt, and the heavy bags of soil stacked on the cart. A cruel, predatory smile spread across his face. He nudged his wife and aimed a manicured finger directly at me. Roland strutted over to my checkout lane, pulling Celeste along by her expensive silk sleeve. He made no effort to lower his voice or honor the quiet rhythm of the store. He wanted the cashier, an older gentleman named Clifford, a man I had known for 15 years, to catch every single word. Roland looked at the heavy bags of dirt and let out a loud theatrical laugh that bounced off the high warehouse ceiling. He told me it was incredibly fitting to find me dressed like a vagrant hauling fertilizer. He said it was precisely the sort of pathetic, low-level existence I was destined for, now that his brilliant son was permanently running my company. I stood completely still. I didn't clench my fists. I didn't raise my voice or fire back. I simply looked directly into Roland's arrogant eyes. I thought about the massive 80-foot yacht sitting in Miami that he was currently enjoying, a vessel purchased entirely with stolen corporate funds. He was a parasite mocking the very host keeping him alive. Celeste stepped forward, her heavy, expensive perfume rolling out in a nauseating wave that smothered the honest smell of the hardware store. She looked at me with an expression of pure, unvarnished contempt. She announced loudly that it was a genuine blessing I had finally found my proper place in the world. She boasted that Derek was going to completely reshape Apex Innovations this weekend and wipe away every last trace of my outdated blue-collar influence. She practically trembled with malicious delight as she described the upcoming merger gala. She informed everyone at the front of the store that her son was on the verge of becoming the most powerful chief executive in the state. She went on about the imported champagne, the celebrity guest list they had assembled, and the glittering, luxurious future her family was walking into. She glanced down at my worn work boots and reminded me that people of my station belonged exactly where I was standing, caked in dirt and entirely forgotten by polite society. She told me to enjoy playing in the mud while the true masters of the universe built something lasting. Roland chuckled smoothly, straightening Roland's ivory merino turtleneck, and added that they would be certain to raise a glass to my miserable retirement while sailing on their new boat. I listened to every insult without breaking eye contact for even a fraction of a second. I gave them nothing, no reaction, no flinch, no defense of my legacy or my clothes. I simply let them talk. I let them dig their own graves with their own arrogant, careless words. They believed they were publicly humiliating a beaten old man. They had absolutely no idea they were addressing the architect of their own destruction. Every cruel word that dropped from Celeste's lips brought back the image of tears running down my daughter Nora's face the night before. Nora had stood shivering in my kitchen, her cards frozen her inheritance, threatened by the very family now sneering at me. That memory fed a cold, lethal calm deep in my chest. Their arrogance was blinding them entirely. The federal agents were already briefed. The corporate trap was fully armed, the legal documents signed. Every insult they hurled at me inside that hardware store only drove another nail into the lid of their coffin. I turned back to Clifford, the cashier who was watching Roland and Celeste, with quiet professional disdain. I handed him 3 crisp $100 bills to cover the potting soil. I told him in a calm, warm voice to keep the change and pick up something nice for his grandchildren this weekend. Clifford gave a respectful nod, paying no attention whatsoever to the 2 loud, obnoxious figures standing behind me. He passed me my receipt and wished me a good afternoon. I gripped the metal handle of the flatbed cart and pushed it right past Roland and Celeste. I didn't say a word to either of them. I didn't spare them a parting glance. I simply walked steadily out through the sliding glass doors and into the bright afternoon light. I loaded the heavy bags into the back of my rusted flatbed truck, feeling the solid weight of the earth in my hands. The storm was arriving Saturday night, and I was entirely ready to watch it sweep them all away. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck midnight, its heavy brass pendulum marking the time with relentless mechanical certainty. I sat alone at my small kitchen table, enclosed in the absolute quiet of a sleeping suburban neighborhood. A single overhead lamp cast stark white light across the dense stacks of legal documents spread before me. Tomorrow night was the grand corporate merger gala. Tomorrow night Derek expected to lock in his reputation as an untouchable corporate titan I turned the page of the forensic audit, slowly tracing the columns of stolen millions with the tip of my pen. There was a profound, almost unsettling stillness inside my chest. The fury that had burned so fiercely all week had burned itself completely out. What had replaced it was cold, precise, and far more dangerous. It was the absolute certainty of a man who had already measured his enemy's grave down to the inch. My phone buzzed against the wooden tabletop, a hard vibration shattering the silence. It was Malcolm. I picked up on the first ring, keeping my voice low so as not to wake Nora. He didn't waste a breath on pleasantries. He told me the federal snare was officially armed. The lead investigator at the Financial Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation had personally reviewed the final dossier we had submitted, the forged invoices, the offshore routing numbers, the dummy shell companies. The evidence was absolutely irrefutable. Malcolm confirmed that a tactical unit of federal agents would arrive at the hotel the following evening in unmarked vehicles. They would take up positions in the service corridors, the underground parking garage, and the private security rooms, well before the first guests set foot inside. They would wait in complete silence, invisible to the arrogant socialites working their way through champagne in the ballroom above. The authorities needed only one thing: my signal. The moment I laid the evidence bare on that stage and publicly exposed the fraud, the agents would move and lock down the entire venue. Nobody would be leaving. The corporate guillotine wasn't merely raised, it was oiled, sharpened, and waiting for the executioner's hand. I thanked Malcolm for his flawless execution of the plan and ended the call. I gathered the audits, the bank transfer logs, and the photographic evidence of Roland and Celeste's luxury purchases. I squared the edges of the thick stack of papers and placed them inside a heavy, dark leather portfolio. I ran my palm over the smooth surface of the leather. This was not simply a collection of corporate records. It was a lethal weapon forged in the fires of their own unbridled greed. It held absolute proof of Derek's parasitic theft and Roland's eager knowing complicity. It was the precise financial machinery they had used to bankroll their counterfeit high society lifestyle, and it was the very instrument that would now drag them into public ruin. I snapped the brass clasp of the portfolio shut. The metallic click landed with the finality of a prison cell door locking. There was no room left for mercy. Mercy is a privilege reserved for people who simply make mistakes. Derek and his parents had not made a mistake. They had made a calculated, predatory decision to destroy my family for the sake of their own vanity. I left the portfolio on the table and walked down the quiet hallway to my bedroom. I opened the deep cedar closet and reached all the way to the back. I pulled out a heavy garment bag that had not seen daylight in exactly 10 years. I unzipped the canvas and carefully drew out a bespoke charcoal gray suit, tailored from the finest Scottish wool. I had commissioned this suit for the evening I officially retired, and handed the reins of Apex Innovations over to the board of directors. It was the armor of the founder. For a decade I had been content to wear faded denim and worn work boots, letting the corporate world forget the man who had built their empire out of nothing. I had settled into the quiet life, genuinely convinced my battles were behind me. But Derek and Roland had demanded a war. They had forced the architect of their very fortress to step back onto the battlefield. I carried the suit to the ironing board standing in the corner of the room. I plugged in the iron and waited for the heat to build, watching steam curl up into the cool air. I laid the charcoal trousers flat across the board and began pressing the fabric with slow, deliberate care. The rhythmic hiss of the steam and the smooth pass of the iron steadied me. It was a simple, repetitive task, but it carried the weight of ritual. With every stroke, I pressed away the humble, invisible old man they had mocked so openly in that hardware store. I was ironing sharp, unforgiving creases into the cloth, preparing the uniform of a corporate executioner. I thought about Nora, asleep in her childhood room just down the hall, her heart broken by a man who had never seen her as anything more than a temporary financial asset. I thought about the sheer arrogance of Derek, striding into my living room and demanding I sign away my dignity and my daughter's inheritance. I thought about Roland laughing at my dirty hands while wearing clothes paid for with my stolen money. Every single memory fed the cold machinery of my resolve. Before we go any further, what you are about to hear is the moment everything I had quietly built was about to be put to its ultimate test. The people who believed they had the upper hand were closer to the edge than they could possibly imagine. Tell me if someone you loved was being used and manipulated right in front of you. Would you step in immediately, or would you wait until the trap was fully set? They believed they were masters of the universe, perched at the very summit of a glittering mountain. They had no idea whatsoever that the mountain they stood on was a volcano, and I was holding the detonator. I hung the perfectly pressed suit on a heavy wooden valet stand by the window. The deep dark fabric seemed to draw in the ambient light, radiating a quiet, heavy authority. Beside it, I laid out a crisp white dress shirt and a silver silk tie. I polished a pair of black Oxford shoes until they shone like dark mirrors, erasing every trace of the gardening soil Roland had found so amusing. The physical transformation was nearly complete. Tomorrow evening, the pathetic, low-class father-in-law they so deeply despised would disappear forever. In his place, the absolute majority shareholder of Apex Innovations would push through the gilded doors of their exclusive gala. I went back into the kitchen and switched off the overhead lamp, letting the room fall into darkness. The leather portfolio sat on the table, a dark silhouette against the polished wood. The collisions course was irrevocably set. Physics and consequence were now in full command. Derek had built his entire kingdom on a foundation of lies, theft, and profound disrespect. Tomorrow night, the weight of his own actions would come crashing down on his head. He wanted a grand spectacle to cement his legacy in front of the city's elite. I was going to give him exactly that. I was going to give him an audience. I stood in the quiet shadows of my home, looking out the window at the empty street. Not a trace of fear or hesitation moved through me. I was completely ready. The long game of patience and silence was officially over. Tomorrow, the whole world would hear the blade fall. The grand ballroom of the City Hotel Ballroom was a cathedral of glass and gold. A massive crystal chandelier hung from the vaulted ceiling, scattering warm, fractured light across a sea of tuxedos and designer gowns. The air was thick with expensive orchids and imported champagne. A jazz quartet played a seamless, polished melody from a raised platform in the corner, providing the ideal backdrop for the illusion of triumph. This was the pinnacle of high society, a carefully assembled collection of politicians, bank executives, and industry leaders. To an outsider, it looked like a celebration of corporate achievement. To me, it was a crime scene. Every shimmering light, every velvet drape, every silver platter of caviar had been paid for with the lifeblood of Apex Innovations. Just an hour before I had stood in the quiet of my modest living room, reviewing the final legal documents one last time. Malcolm had called on a secure line to confirm the trap was fully primed. The Financial Crimes Unit of the Federal Bureau of Investigation had gone through the audit dossier we provided with meticulous care. They had traced every forged invoice and every offshore shell company directly back to Derek. Malcolm assured me that federal agents were already in positions stationed in the service corridors and completely invisible to the wealthy guests inside. There was no room left for mercy whatsoever. I had spent the previous hour in my bedroom carefully pressing the bespoke charcoal gray suit, tailored from the finest Scottish wool that I had kept sealed in a cedar closet for 10 years. It was the founder's armor, a garment I had commissioned for the night I first stepped away from the company. The moment I slipped the heavy wool jacket over my shoulders, the humble, invisible old man ceased to exist. I picked up the dark leather folder holding the absolute proof of Derek's theft and Roland's complicity. The collision course was locked. Now I stood in the shadowed alcove of the mezzanine balcony, entirely out of sight, surveying the floor below with the cold precision of a predator watching its prey. Derek occupied the exact center of the room, holding a crystal flute of champagne as though it were a royal scepter. He was surrounded by a tight cluster of senior board members and wealthy investors. He threw his head back, laughing at someone's joke, his teeth catching the light. His tailored tuxedo fit him without a flaw, projecting the aura of untouchable power. He looked like a man who had conquered the world. He was playing the visionary chief executive to perfection, utterly blind to the fact that his corporate credit cards had been frozen and his executive authority stripped away by my hand more than 24 hours ago. He was a ghost, haunting his own party, carrying himself like an invincible king while standing on a trapdoor. A few yards from Derek Roland and Celeste were putting on their own sickening display. They drifted through the crowd of dignitaries like royalty surveying subjects. Roland was aggressively clapping the shoulder of a prominent city alderman, leaning in close to whisper some fabricated account of his financial acumen. On his wrist sat a diamond-studded watch I knew for an absolute fact had been purchased, with funds diverted from our logistics payroll. Celeste was worse still. She moved through the room trailing her silk gown, a heavy diamond necklace catching every beam of light with each step she took. She was introducing herself to the wives of our largest shareholders as though she were the matriarch of an established dynasty. They were flaunting their stolen wealth, drunk on the attention absorbing the deference of people who would not have given them a second glance if they knew the truth. They were completely insulated by their own arrogance. They didn't notice the broad-shouldered men in dark suits standing near the service exits with earpieces. They didn't see the federal agents waiting in the shadows. I checked the gold pocket watch Elaine had given me on our 20th anniversary. The time for observation was finished. The mandatory shareholder disclosure meeting I had quietly forced the legal department to schedule was set to begin in exactly 3 minutes. I turned from the balcony and descended the sweeping carpeted staircase toward the main foyer. With every step, the weight of the past week lifted from me. The crisp, heavy wool of the charcoal gray suit pulled cleanly across my shoulders, commanding respect and projecting absolute, uncompromising authority. The physical transformation was stark. I was no longer the pathetic, uneducated father-in-law they had ridiculed in the hardware store. I was the architect. I was the absolute majority shareholder of Apex Innovations, and I was here to reclaim what was mine. I reached the bottom of the staircase and stepped onto the marble floor of the grand foyer. Two massive mahogany doors stood between me and the ballroom. I did not pause. I did not wait for an invitation. I placed both palms flat against the polished wood and shoved the heavy doors open with a forceful, echoing crack. The heavy thud of those doors hitting the walls cut straight through the ambient noise of the gala. The jazz quartet faltered the high notes, stumbling as the musicians glanced toward the entrance. A ripple of silence moved across the room, starting at the back and rolling swiftly toward the center. Hundreds of heads turned to see who had dared to interrupt the evening's careful choreography. I stepped into the brilliant light of the ballroom. I did not move with the slow, shuffling gait of a retired old man. I walked with long, deliberate strides, my posture perfectly straight, my eyes fixed dead ahead. The charcoal gray suit drew the light into it, making me look like a dark, immovable pillar against the room's vibrant colors. The younger executives and politicians looked merely puzzled, unsure who this imposing figure was. But the older board members, the men and women who had been with Apex Innovations since the early years, knew me the moment they saw me. I watched the color drain from our chief financial officer's face. I saw the lead legal counsel lurch backward, his champagne glass slipping from his hand and landing on the thick carpet. The whispers erupted and spread like fire through dry grass. The board members were terrified. The ghost had returned. The wave of stunned silence reached the center of the room. Derek stopped talking mid-sentence. He turned around with an irritated scowl, clearly annoyed that his audience had looked away. His eyes found me moving steadily across the ballroom floor. For just a fraction of a second, his brain refused to process what it was seeing. He recognized the face of the man he had abused in a small kitchen, but the posture, the clothing, and the terrifying presence did not match the image he had filed away. Roland and Celeste stopped their parade cold. Celeste's hand flew to her stolen diamond necklace, her jaw falling open in sheer disbelief. Roland's arrogant smile collapsed, replaced by an expression of profound, paralyzing confusion. They had explicitly banned me from attending. They had threatened to have me thrown into the street. Yet here I was, walking through the very heart of their kingdom, radiating absolute authority, and not a single security guard moved to stand in my path. I didn't stop. I kept my eyes fixed on Derek, moving directly toward the main stage, the heavy leather folder in my hand carrying the end of his life. The music inside the City Hotel ballroom seemed to dissolve into a dull, vibrating hum as I crossed the polished marble floor. The crowd of politicians, bank executives, and corporate leaders parted ahead of me instinctively, as though sensing a sudden heavy shift in the room's atmosphere. They didn't know who I was, but they recognized the absolute authority radiating from the charcoal gray suit. Roland and Celeste were stationed near a towering, glittering ice sculpture holding crystal flutes of imported champagne. Celeste spotted me first. I watched the color drain completely from her heavily powdered face. Her hand shook so violently that a splash of golden liquid ran down the front of her expensive silk gown. She seized Roland by the arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the fabric of his sleeve. Roland turned, following the line of her terrified gaze. His initial expression of mild, wealthy irritation twisted instantly into a mask of furious, unvarnished rage. They abandoned their conversation with a prominent local politician on the spot and came straight for me. They moved with the frantic, aggressive energy of people who understood that their carefully constructed illusion was about to be torn apart. Roland planted himself in my path, stepping close enough that I caught the sharp bite of alcohol on his breath. He looked me up and down, his eyes practically bulging. He didn't register the immaculate tailoring or the quality of the bespoke Scottish wool draped across my shoulders. He saw only the man he had mocked so ruthlessly in the hardware store, the man he was convinced belonged in the dirt. He dropped his voice to a vicious hiss, demanding to know how a pathetic beggar had gotten through the front doors. He accused me of slipping in through the service entrance like a rat looking for scraps. Celeste moved up right beside him, her face flushed deep with venom. She hissed that I was a disgusting embarrassment to her family and to everyone in that room. She told me I was deliberately trying to sabotage the most important night of her son's life. She ordered me to turn around, walk out, and crawl back to my miserable suburban house before she had me physically removed. I didn't blink. I didn't offer them a single word. I stood perfectly still, my hands resting lightly on the dark leather folder at my side. I looked straight through them, extending exactly the level of significance they genuinely deserved, which was none at all. The commotion had not gone unnoticed. Across the ballroom, Derek stood frozen near the main stage, surrounded by the executive board of directors, the very people he needed most to impress, in order to lock down his corporate takeover. I watched him register the disturbance. I watched his eyes find my face. The sheer blinding panic that swept across his features was a magnificent thing to witness. His practiced, arrogant smile collapsed entirely. He excused himself quickly from the circle of senior executives, his neck flushing a deep, angry crimson. He pushed across the ballroom floor his polished shoes, striking the marble with heavy, aggressive thuds. He was sweating under the bright chandelier lights. The confident, untouchable king of Apex Innovations was terrified of a single old man standing quietly in his ballroom. Derek shouldered past a cluster of startled investors and inserted himself directly between Roland and me. He dropped his voice to a trembling, vicious growl. He asked me if I had completely lost my mind. He reminded me aggressively of the legal documents I had signed in my living room just 24 hours ago. He told me I had permanently surrendered every right I had to his family and to his company. He demanded to know why I was deliberately humiliating him in front of the wealthy elite who controlled his future. He threatened to destroy my relationship with Nora entirely. He promised to ensure I died completely alone, cut off from my only daughter and any future grandchildren. He was practically vibrating with rage, projecting all of his guilt, fear, and arrogance directly onto me. He genuinely believed he still held every card. He was certain he could bully me back into quiet submission. I let his threats hang in the cold, tense air between us. I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice or match his frantic, sweating energy. I simply stood there, a solid, immovable wall of charcoal gray wool, holding the physical proof of his impending federal indictment. I noted the heavy beads of sweat forming on his forehead. I watched the way his hand trembled as he jabbed a finger toward my chest. He was coming apart right in front of me. He could not comprehend why his threats were no longer landing. He couldn't understand why the uneducated father-in-law wasn't cowering. My absolute silence enraged him far more than any insult could have. It drove him straight to the edge. Derek understood that verbal intimidation was failing him. His eyes swept frantically around the crowded room, searching for a way to reassert control of his narrative. He raised his hand and snapped his fingers sharply in the air, cutting a signal across the ballroom. He locked eyes with the head of corporate security, a massive, broad-shouldered man posted near the main entrance. Derek leveled a finger directly at me. He ordered the security chief to remove me from the premises immediately. He wasn't keeping his voice down anymore. He wanted the people around him to watch him assert his dominance. He announced loudly that I was a deranged trespasser who had been harassing his family for months. He instructed the security team to drag me out, throw me onto the pavement, and call the city police. He declared he was filing full criminal charges for trespassing and harassment. He wanted a brutal public spectacle of my removal. He wanted the entire board of directors to see him crush a threat without hesitation. Roland and Celeste smirked, crossing their arms in unified malicious satisfaction. They were eager to watch me publicly humiliated and physically hauled out of the hotel. The head of security began to move. He was a seasoned professional, a man I had personally approved for hire over a decade ago to protect the Apex Innovations corporate headquarters. He marched across the floor, his face a mask of strict, unreadable duty. Two other large guards flanked him, moving in tight formation toward me. The crowd pulled back, creating space for the impending confrontation. Derek sneered, whispering that my pathetic little rebellion was officially finished. He told me I was about to spend the night in a concrete holding cell. I kept my breathing slow and perfectly even. I did not move a single step backward. I kept both hands firmly on the dark leather folder. The security chief reached us. He raised his heavy hand, preparing to grip my shoulder and steer me toward the exit. Derek stepped back with a satisfied smirk, giving his men room to do their work. But that heavy hand never made contact with my suit. Before the security chief could touch me, a tall, immaculate figure stepped smoothly out from the shadow of a nearby mezzanine pillar. It was Malcolm. My chief legal counsel moved with the quiet, predatory composure of a man who owned every inch of the battlefield. He didn't shout. He didn't hurry. He simply walked into the precise center of the confrontation and took his place directly beside me. The head of security stopped dead. His raised hand froze completely in midair. The veteran guard recognized Malcolm at once. Every senior member of the Apex Innovation Security Division knew that Malcolm served as the sole representative of the anonymous founders' blind trust. Malcolm was the highest legal authority in the entire corporate structure, superseding the chief executive officer entirely. The security chief looked at Malcolm, then looked at me standing calmly at his side in the bespoke suit, holding the executive portfolio. The reality of the situation struck the man like a physical blow. He understood immediately the catastrophic magnitude of what he was witnessing. He recognized the true chain of command. The big man lowered his hand without a word. He took a deliberate step back, squared his shoulders, and bowed his head in my direction with quiet respect. He did not look at Derek. He did not acknowledge Roland or Celeste. The authority of the room had shifted with violent finality, and Derek was left standing fully exposed in the wreckage of his own shattered world. Malcolm didn't wait for the security chief to fully retreat. He turned from the guards and walked with purpose toward the grand stage at the far end of the ballroom. His footsteps were silent on the thick carpet, yet the crowd parted for him instinctively. People knew the chief legal counsel of the Blind Trust on site. They understood that his presence at a microphone meant corporate business of the highest possible order. The jazz quartet was still playing a soft, measured piece from their corner of the room, entirely unaware of the tectonic shift that had just taken place on the floor below. Malcolm climbed the 3 short steps to the stage. He walked up to the sleek silver microphone standing at the center of the stage. 2 sharp taps of his index finger against the metal mesh rang out like gunshots across the vast room. The musicians flinched in their seats. The cellist dragged his bow harshly across the strings, producing a discordant screech before the music died completely. The silence that followed was total and suffocating. Hundreds of conversations stopped in the same instant. The chime of crystal and the low murmur of high society small talk vanished, replaced by a thick pressing anticipation. Every eye in that luxurious ballroom locked onto Malcolm. He adjusted the microphone and surveyed the assembled crowd of wealthy investors, politicians, and corporate executives. He did not smile. His voice was a calm, resonant baritone that carried the unmistakable weight of federal authority. He formally called an emergency mandatory shareholder disclosure meeting to order. A wave of confusion moved through the crowd. Gala evenings were designed for champagne toasts and merger celebrations, not the invocation of emergency corporate bylaws. A handful of board members began trading nervous glances. They recognized the legal language Malcolm was deploying. They knew that a mandatory shareholder meeting could only be called under conditions of severe financial peril or executive misconduct. Malcolm pressed forward without a single pause. He stated that under the specific provisions of the corporate charter, the absolute majority shareholder held the unilateral right to freeze all executive actions and address the board of directors at any time. He announced that for the first time in a decade, the anonymous founder of Apex Innovations had chosen to step out from the shadows. The founder had watched the internal rot spreading through his company and had come personally to set things right. That founder, he said, was standing in this very room right now. Derek let out a loud theatrical scoff that rang clearly through the hushed ballroom. He straightened his expensive silk tie and squared his shoulders. He was completely blind to the reality tightening around him. He genuinely believed this was some dramatic corporate flourish, a staged introduction arranged by the reclusive billionaire to publicly bless the merger and validate his leadership in front of the whole room. Derek scanned the crowd of older wealthy men in custom tuxedos, searching for a face he could work. He readied his most polished winning smile. He imagined himself shaking hands with a legendary business titan, being welcomed onto the stage as a peer. He assumed the founder would clap him on the shoulder and praise his sharp mind before the entire city. He was already composing the press release in his head. His vanity sealed him off completely from the cold truth, standing just a few yards away. Malcolm did not scan the room. He kept his gaze perfectly level. He raised his right hand and pointed one steady finger directly at me. The crowd turned as one following the invisible line from the stage to where I stood in my bespoke charcoal gray suit, tailored from the finest Scottish wool. The weight of 1,000 eyes hit me all at once. I did not hurry. I tightened my grip on the heavy leather folder holding the forensic audit. I began walking toward the stage. The crowd opened before me like water clearing a wide path. Every step was measured and deliberate. I was no longer the weathered man buying soil at the hardware store. I was no longer the quiet, obliging father-in-law they had felt safe dismissing and abusing. I was the architect of the very ground beneath their feet. I walked past the ashen faces of senior vice presidents who could already feel the balance of power shifting. I walked past the federal agents stationed silently near the exits, who were waiting only for me to speak the words that would authorize their arrest warrants. I reached the wooden steps leading up to the platform and climbed. The firm thud of my polished shoes against the wood rang out in that silent room with each step. I took my place beside Malcolm on the stage and looked down at the crowd. Derek stood in the front row less than 10 FT away. The arrogant smile had evaporated entirely from his face. The healthy color drained from his skin in an instant, leaving him the shade of dirty ash. His mouth fell open slightly, but no sound came out. He stared up at me, eyes wide, with a raw, unguarded terror he could not hide. His mind was violently rejecting what it was seeing. The man who held absolute power over his entire existence was the same man he had mocked, robbed, and tried to throw into the street just moments ago. In that agonizing second, he understood that his career, his wealth, and his freedom were entirely in my hands. His gaze dropped to the thick leather folder under my arm, and he knew his perfect crime had been fully exposed. A few feet away, Roland and Celeste stood frozen in absolute shock. Celeste was rigid as stone. Her hand was still clutching her stolen diamond necklace, knuckles gone bone white. She took in my bespoke suit and the undeniable authority I commanded from that stage. The sickening realization that she had just spent 30 minutes publicly humiliating the billionaire founder of the company crashed over her like a physical blow. Roland looked as though he might be violently ill. He swayed slightly on his expensive Italian loafers. The smug predatory sneer he had worn all evening was gone, replaced by the wide-eyed stare of a cornered animal. They had spent years erecting a false dynasty on the foundation of my quiet labor. They had taken my kindness for weakness. They had mistaken my preference for a simple private life as evidence of limited intelligence or ambition. Now the entire foundation of their stolen empire was dissolving beneath their feet. The millions they had siphoned off the luxury cars they drove, The exotic vacations they flaunted, all of it was about to be catalogued as federal evidence. The silence in the ballroom stretched taut and heavy with impending devastation. I stood at the center of that stage, looking out over the empire I had built from nothing. I opened the heavy leather folder and prepared to dismantle their world completely. I gripped the sides of the polished acrylic podium and looked out over a sea of terrified faces. The quiet in that grand ballroom was so complete I could hear the faint hum of the stage lights overhead. I did not raise my voice. There was no need to shout. True power does not require volume. It requires absolute, unshakable certainty. I leaned into the silver microphone and my voice carried through the vast space with a precision that left no room for doubt. I welcomed the board of directors, the shareholders, and the distinguished guests to this mandatory emergency disclosure meeting. I told them that for the past decade, I had entrusted the daily operations of Apex Innovations to a new generation of leadership. I had believed in their vision and their integrity, but trust without verification is simply foolishness, and my recent verification had uncovered a staggering level of betrayal. I raised my right hand and gave a sharp, brief nod to the audiovisual technicians in the glass booth at the back of the room. Malcolm had secured their complete cooperation hours earlier. The massive high-definition screens behind me had been displaying the glowing logo of the upcoming corporate merger. In a fraction of a second they went black. Then they lit up with something far more revealing. Enormous blown-up images of offshore bank statements, corporate ledgers, and shell company registries flooded the screens. The harsh white light of those financial documents washed over the stunned faces of the elite crowd. I began to speak, methodically walking the board of directors through every step of the fraud. I laid out in detail the fake vendors Derek had created to funnel cash out of our hardware division. I showed the room exactly how he had manipulated the quarterly earnings reports to mask the financial hemorrhaging. I pointed to specific wire transfer logs calling out the exact dates and exact amounts diverted into untraceable accounts. The audience stared at the screens in horror. These were bankers, politicians, and seasoned investors. They knew precisely what they were looking at. They were staring at a textbook embezzlement scheme executed at the highest level of corporate leadership. I gave them no room to look away. I narrated the movement of the stolen money, tracing it from the corporate treasury, through a labyrinth of dummy corporations, and into the personal private accounts of the man standing in the front row. I watched the senior vice presidents physically step back from Derek as if his corruption were something they might catch. The murmurs of disbelief spread through the room, growing louder with every new piece of evidence I laid before them. The elite crowd was arriving at the same conclusion the man they had spent the evening celebrating was nothing more than a highly skilled parasite. But I was not finished. The corporate theft was only one part of this reckoning. The personal arrogance of his family demanded a far more specific dismantling. I pressed a button on the podium, and the massive screens shifted again. A highly detailed official ownership deed for an 80th luxury yacht blazed onto the displays. The purchase price was circled in bright red ink. Right beside the deed sat the corresponding wire transfer from an Apex Innovations Phantom account, matching the exact dollar amount down to the very last cent. I looked directly at Roland and Celeste, standing frozen in the middle of the crowd. I spoke clearly and deliberately into the microphone. I announced to the entire ballroom that the gilded lifestyle of the chief executive officer's family was nothing but a hollow illusion, funded entirely by stolen corporate capital. I pointed out that the very clothes on their backs, the designer jewelry they were parading around, and the champagne in their hands had all been purchased with money taken from my company. Roland went the color of chalk. He shrank back into the crowd, desperately trying to disappear from the merciless glare of the screens. Celeste let out a choked gasp and covered her mouth with trembling hands. Her diamond necklace suddenly looked like a chain around her throat. The elite crowd around them pulled back immediately, leaving Roland and Celeste stranded in a wide circle of complete social isolation. The high society guests who had been sipping their expensive champagne now regarded their glasses as though the liquid had turned to poison. The politicians and socialites who had been fawning over them just 10 minutes ago stared at them with open, undisguised contempt. I had exposed their fabricated wealth and their counterfeit aristocracy before the very people they had spent years trying to impress. They were not titans of industry. They were common thieves playing dress up with my money. The collective gasp from the room was a beautiful symphony of ruined reputations. Derek could no longer hold himself together under the total destruction of his world. His mind buckled beneath the crushing weight of public humiliation. He let out a desperate, ragged shout and lunged toward the wooden steps of the stage. He scrambled up the stairs, his perfectly tailored tuxedo pulling awkwardly across his sweating frame. His face was a twisted mask of sheer panic. He reached out with shaking hands, trying to physically wrench the microphone away from me. He stammered wildly, shouting that the documents were forged, that this was an elaborate conspiracy to frame him. He begged the board of directors to disregard every word I was saying. He sounded like a frightened child caught in a catastrophic lie. He looked utterly pathetic, shredding the last remnants of his carefully constructed executive image in front of every person who mattered. Malcolm stepped forward sharply, ready to physically block him, but I raised my hand and stopped my lawyer. I had no need of protection from a broken man. I held my ground, immovable and calm, as Derek frantically clawed at the air between us. He was weeping now, tears of terror and shame destroying his polished appearance. He rambled that he could fix everything, that he could return the money, that he only needed one more chance to walk them through the complex financial structures. His breathless, frantic pleading echoed through the microphone, broadcasting his desperation to every corner of the room. He promised to step down quietly if I would only switch off the screens and let him walk away. I looked him dead in the eye. All the noise faded until there was nothing left but the space between us. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I leaned into the microphone, my voice carrying to the very back of the hall and out into the city beyond. I told him that his explanations were worthless and his promises were empty. I told him that his reign as a master of the universe was permanently finished. With a voice as cold and hard as steel, I delivered the final absolute sentence. I told Derek that effective. Immediately he was fired from Apex Innovations. I stripped him of his title, his authority, and his access. I told him he was nothing but a petty thief in a borrowed suit, and he would never set foot in my building again. The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. The public execution was complete. Derek collapsed to his knees right there on the stage, sobbing into his hands, as the full weight of his total ruin finally came down on him. He was a crumpled heap of tailored wool and shattered ego on the polished floorboards. The echo of his termination still hung in the dead silence of the grand ballroom. The assembled crowd of politicians and corporate titans stood completely paralyzed. They held their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. I looked down at the man who had tried to steal my life and destroy my daughter. He was sobbing softly into his palms. Every trace of his false bravado had been stripped away. But firing him was merely an administrative correction, a corporate formality. The true penalty for his profound betrayal had to reach far beyond the walls of Apex Innovations. I drew my gaze slowly away from Derek and looked toward the back of the vast room. I raised my right hand into the air, a simple silent gesture. It was the signal Malcolm and I had meticulously planned hours earlier. The heavy mahogany doors at the main entrance of the ballroom swung violently inward. They struck the walls with a thunderous crash that made several wealthy guests flinch in pure alarm. A team of 12 federal agents from the Financial Crimes Division marched into the room. They wore dark tactical suits and heavy vests emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Their arrival shattered the fragile illusion of high society elegance completely. They moved with absolute military precision. Their heavy black boots struck the marble floors in a steady, terrifying rhythm. The wealthy guests parted instantly like water. Men in custom tuxedos and women in designer gowns practically climbed over one another to clear a path. Nobody wanted to be standing anywhere near the blast radius of a federal raid. The lead agent walked straight toward the main stage without glancing left or right. He climbed the wooden steps with heavy, purposeful strides. 2 agents flanked him closely, covering his blind spots. Derek lifted his tear-stained face just in time to find federal authorities closing in around him. He tried to scramble backward like a cornered rat. He babbled incoherent pleas, promising he could explain everything to a judge if they would only wait. The lead agent paid no attention to his whimpering. He grabbed Derek firmly by the shoulder of his expensive tuxedo jacket and hauled him to his feet. He wrenched Derek's arms behind his back. The sharp, metallic snap of heavy steel handcuffs closing around Derek's wrists rang out clearly through the microphone I was still standing beside. It was the sweetest sound I had heard in 10 years. Derek let out a high-pitched wail of despair as the cold steel bit into his skin. The untouchable corporate king was instantly reduced to a weeping federal prisoner. Down on the ballroom floor, the reality of what was unfolding finally registered in Roland's arrogant brain. He watched his son placed in handcuffs. He saw the federal raid spreading across the room. The cowardly instinct that had defined his entire pathetic existence took over completely. He made no move to help his son. He did not even glance at his wife. Roland simply turned on his spotless tan loafers and bolted. He shoved a prominent city alderman out of his path and sprinted desperately toward the side exit near the catering kitchen. He looked absolutely ridiculous running in his ivory merino turtleneck. He believed he could slip away into the night and escape the catastrophic consequences of his own greed. But Malcolm had accounted for every possible variable. 2 federal agents had been stationed silently at that exact exit for over an hour. As Roland threw his weight against the brass handle of the door, they stepped out of the shadows and intercepted him with brutal efficiency. One agent grabbed Roland by his turtleneck and pressed him firmly against the patterned wallpaper. Roland shrieked in pain and terror as his hands were wrenched behind his back and locked in heavy iron cuffs. Celeste stood completely frozen near the towering ice sculpture. She watched her husband pinned against the wall and her son held captive on the stage. Her heavily powdered face had become a mask of pure, unguarded horror. A female federal agent approached her with a stern, unyielding expression. The agent produced a thick stack of legal warrants from her jacket. She announced loudly that Roland and Celeste were officially under investigation for federal racketeering and receiving stolen corporate capital. She informed the entire silent ballroom that every one of their bank accounts had been fully frozen. She stated that their luxury vehicles, their offshore accounts, and the massive 80-FT yacht docked in Miami had been immediately seized by the federal government. The agent turned directly to Celeste and demanded she surrender the diamond necklace she had on. It had been purchased with embezzled funds and was now classified as active federal evidence. Celeste let out a guttural, agonizing scream, the sound of a woman watching her entire fabricated world burn to nothing. Her knees buckled beneath her silk trench coat. She crumpled violently onto the polished floor, weeping hysterically. The female agent showed not a trace of sympathy. She leaned down and unclasped the heavy diamond necklace from Celeste's neck in one swift motion. She dropped the glittering jewels into a clear plastic evidence bag with a flat, dismissive thud. Celeste knelt on the floor, sobbing and gasping for breath. She reached out with shaking hands toward the wealthy guests she had spent all evening trying to impress. She begged for help. She pleaded for someone to call a lawyer, but the elite crowd simply stared back at her with cold, unblinking contempt. The society she had craved so desperately was now looking at her like something diseased. The lead agent on the stage gave a sharp nod to his team. The authorities began marching Derek Roland and Celeste toward the main entrance. It was a procession of absolute, total disgrace. Derek stumbled down the stage steps with his head hanging low, hiding his tear-streaked face. He could not meet the eyes of the board members who had just watched his complete unraveling. Roland was hauled by the collar of his ruined turtleneck, his spotless tan loafers dragging against the carpet. He blubbered incoherently, twisting his face away from the staring crowd. Celeste was forced upright and marched alongside them, her makeup tracking down her face in dark, ugly streaks. The entire ballroom watched in absolute silence as the counterfeit aristocratic family was escorted out into the cold night. They walked out of that luxurious hotel in steel handcuffs, stripped bare of their stolen wealth and their manufactured dignity. I stood tall at the podium and watched the heavy mahogany doors swing shut behind them. The corporate cancer had been fully excised. The air in the ballroom felt suddenly clean. The federal agents had carried out their duties with flawless precision, leaving no room for ambiguity. The long, brutal war was officially finished. I looked out at the silent crowd of executives and investors. They stared at me with a powerful mixture of awe and genuine fear. They now understood the true cost of betraying the foundation of this company. I straightened my charcoal gray suit and prepared to address my board of directors. The true founder of Apex Innovations had reclaimed his stolen empire entirely, and a new era of absolute integrity was about to begin. The grand ballroom began to empty, leaving a deep and heavy silence in its wake. The shaken corporate elite and wealthy socialites streamed through the gilded exit doors, desperate to put distance between themselves and the catastrophic federal raid they had just witnessed. The jazz quartet had packed up their instruments and slipped quietly into the night. The catering staff moved like ghosts, clearing away half-empty crystal champagne flutes and untouched silver platters of caviar. The opulent space that only an hour ago had felt like an impenetrable fortress of arrogance now resembled a hollow, abandoned theater after the final curtain. I stood near the edge of the main stage and drew a slow, deep breath. The heavy wool of my bespoke charcoal gray suit felt somehow lighter on my shoulders. The corporate execution was complete, and the federal authorities were processing the prisoners. But my most important task of the evening was still ahead of me. I turned from the empty podium and scanned the wide expanse of polished marble floor. I found her near the massive mahogany doors at the very back of the room. Nora looked impossibly small in that cavernous space. She wore a simple dark dress that stood in sharp contrast to the extravagant gowns the other women had flaunted all evening. She was gripping the edge of a velvet-draped cocktail table, her knuckles drained of color. Even from across the room, I could see her shoulders trembling. She had watched the entire spectacle from the shadows. She had witnessed the total destruction of her husband's false empire and the staggering revelation of her father's true identity. The foundation of her reality had been violently broken apart and reassembled in the span of 30 minutes. I stepped down from the stage and began crossing the ballroom floor. My leather shoes made a soft, steady rhythm against the marble, carrying me toward my only daughter. As I drew closer, Nora slowly lifted her head. Her eyes were wide, swirling with shock, confusion, and a raw, overwhelming sense of awe. She took in my tailored suit and the unmistakable posture of authority I now wore. Her entire life, she had known me as a quiet, unpretentious man who worked with his hands and preferred the scent of cedar sawdust to expensive cologne. She had watched me absorb the relentless condescension of her husband and his arrogant parents without ever raising my voice. Now she was standing in front of the absolute majority shareholder of a multinational corporation, the man who had just dismantled a fraudulent dynasty with a single command. I stopped a few feet away. I did not speak right away. I simply opened my arms. Nora let out a soft, breathless sound and closed the distance between us. She collapsed against my chest, pressing her face into the dark wool of my jacket. I wrapped my arms around her and pulled her into a fierce, protective embrace. I held her with the same desperate strength I had used when she was a small girl, waking from a nightmare. I felt the violent trembling in her body gradually quiet as she leaned into me. The cold, sterile atmosphere of the hotel ballroom fell away, leaving only the unbreakable bond between a father and his child. Nora gripped the lapels of my jacket, her tears soaking into the fabric. She pulled back slightly and looked up into my eyes. She told me she finally understood everything. She whispered that the missing pieces had suddenly slammed into place. She grasped the full depth of the horrific deceit Derek had woven around her. She saw now that his sudden romantic interest, his rushed marriage proposal, and his constant efforts to isolate her had all been carefully calculated steps in a predatory financial scheme. He had never loved her. He had only ever loved the proximity to power and the potential access to a fortune he believed he could steal. Nora gave voice to that terrible realization in a trembling whisper, but her eyes were clear. The toxic illusion of her marriage was entirely shattered. I kept my hands resting gently on her shoulders, anchoring her. I knew I owed her a profound accounting for the deception I had sustained for so many years. I spoke in a quiet, steady voice, making sure every word carried the full weight of my love. I told her that building a vast corporate empire brings a very particular and dangerous kind of visibility. It draws in parasites and opportunists who measure human worth entirely by bank accounts and stock valuations. When her mother passed away and I was left to raise her on my own, I made a solemn vow to keep her shielded from that toxic artificial world. I explained that I concealed the wealth and stepped back from any public executive role because I wanted her to grow up rooted in reality. I wanted her to value hard work, honesty, and genuine human connection. Most importantly, I wanted her to be loved entirely for the brilliant and beautiful person she was, not for the size of a hidden trust fund. She needed to move through the world without the corrupting shadow of a massive inheritance darkening every relationship she formed. I told Nora that true wealth is invisible. It is not found in diamond necklaces, luxury yachts, or imported champagne. It lives in character and integrity. I wanted her to build her life on those solid principles. But in my desperate effort to shield her from the darkness of the corporate world, I had left a blind spot without realizing it. I lowered my head and offered my daughter a sincere, heavy apology. I told her I was sorry for allowing a parasite like Derek to work his way into our lives and manipulate her trust. I told her how deeply sorry I was for the pain he had put her through and for the tears she had shed in our kitchen just a few nights before. I had been so consumed with maintaining the appearance of a simple life that I let a predator cross our threshold. I acknowledged that it was my greatest failure as a father and a mistake I would never repeat. I wiped a stray tear from her cheek with my thumb. I looked into her eyes and made her an absolute promise. I told her she was completely and permanently free. The legal trap had been closed and the federal authorities had removed the threat from her life. Derek and his corrupt family would spend the rest of their days facing the catastrophic consequences of their own boundless greed. They would never cast a shadow over her life again. She was free now, and everything ahead of her belonged entirely to her. Nora looked up at me, and I watched something shift behind her eyes. The shadow of fear and betrayal that had lived there for months simply lifted. A long, shuddering breath escaped her, and then the tears came again. Not grief this time, not anguish. These were the tears of a woman who had just been cut loose from something that had been slowly strangling her. The crushing weight of a fraudulent marriage was gone. She pressed her head back against my chest, arms wrapped tight around me. Around us the grand ballroom sat hollow and still. The wreckage of a fallen empire, nothing but a faint echo. The worst of it was behind us. I pulled her close and let myself feel that. We had taken everything they threw at us, and had not bent once. 6 months was all it took to reduce their empire to dust. The federal justice system does not move quickly, but when it moves with a certainty that arrogance cannot survive. Derek never saw the inside of a courtroom for any length of time. Malcolm's forensic evidence was so complete, so airtight, that Derek's own lawyers told him resisting was pointless. He pleaded guilty to wire fraud, embezzlement, and corporate racketeering, signed away his future to avoid the spectacle of a trial that he would have lost spectacularly. Anyway, the sentencing judge had no interest in mercy for a man who had weaponized a position of trust to plunder millions. 10 years. Maximum security, federal penitentiary. The penthouse, the motorcades, the tailored wardrobe, all of it gone, replaced by a standard issue bright orange jumpsuit. The man who once silenced boardrooms with a single raised eyebrow now has to request permission to make a phone call. Prison schedules him the shriek of alarms at dawn, the grinding clang of iron doors, the thin mattress and 4 concrete walls, and noise that never stops. He lies awake in that cell, understanding at last, and far too late, that his own hunger for more was the thing that built the bars around him. Derek's plea deal was the first domino. It pulled Roland and Celeste directly into the government's path. The investigators had no intention of stopping at the sun. They traced the money with the patience of people who do this for a living. The 80th yacht in Miami gone seized by federal marshals and put on the auction block to partially repay the blind trust. Every imported luxury car vanished from the driveway overnight, hauled off by government tow trucks. Every account they had gorged themselves on was locked tight and drained. The fortune they had convinced themselves they deserved simply ceased to exist. Federal racketeering statutes are broad, and they are ruthless, and they swept up everything The art on the walls, the jewelry in the drawers, the designer wardrobe hanging in the closets. Roland and Celeste stood watching as agents carried it all out in labeled boxes, the entire stolen architecture of their lives being dismantled piece by piece. What their son's scheme had taken years to build, the government unmade in a matter of weeks. For Roland, it was humiliation. For Celeste, it was something closer to annihilation. High society has no patience for scandal. Derek's name appeared in the morning papers, and the verdict was delivered before breakfast was finished. Roland and Celeste were finished. Country club memberships gone. The steady flow of gala invitations gone. Celeste picked up her phone and worked through her contacts one by one, looking for anyone willing to take her call. Not one of them answered. The same women who had clinked glasses with her and laughed at her jokes now redirected their gaze when she appeared on the street. Roland's experience was identical. The businessmen and politicians who had welcomed him onto their golf courses acted as though the name meant nothing to them. The social world they had clawed their way into for years rejected them the way a body rejects a foreign object. It was always going to end this way because none of it had ever been real. Every friendship, every invitation, every connection, all of it rented with stolen money. Strip the money away and there was nothing underneath. Losing the assets was one blow. Being ejected from their sprawling mansion was another, but those were practical catastrophes. What replaced their old life was something they were constitutionally unprepared for. They ended up in a one-bedroom apartment at the ragged edge of the city, the kind of building where the paint on the exterior is perpetually peeling and the hallways smell of damp. No marble floors in the lobby. No one to park the car they no longer owned. The kitchen had peeling linoleum and a refrigerator that shuddered through the night like something dying. Celeste had never clipped a coupon. Now she stood in discount grocery aisles, doing the arithmetic on store-brand products, learning the bus routes, because there was no other way to get anywhere. The wardrobe she had treasured, silk hand-stitched imported, was packed into garbage bags to make room in the tiny closet for clothing that was merely warm and merely functional. Every morning was a tutorial in how far she had fallen. Roland had it differently, but no better. He had performed wealth his entire adult life without ever doing the underlying work that creates it. Now poverty arrived with its demands, and he had nothing to offer in return. Bills accumulated on a table barely large enough for 2 plates. Derek was in a federal cell. No one was going to steal for them anymore. At 60, with his reputation in ruins and his resume essentially empty, Roland went looking for work. What he found was that store managers would glance at his application and move on without a word. The man who once condescended to service workers from the deck of a vessel he didn't pay for was now begging those same industries for entry-level consideration and being turned away. He sat in the cold apartment for hours each day watching the wall, the old confidence rotted away and replaced by a dread of the first of the month and what it would demand. He had organized his self-image entirely around the idea of his own superiority. Now the people he had mocked most were the people he needed to hire him, and they didn't. The walls of that apartment were the final indignity. Roland and Celeste had nowhere else to go, no room to breathe, no distraction from each other or from what they had done. The recriminations started and never really stopped. Roland blamed Celeste's appetite for more trips, more jewelry, more status for pressuring Derek to keep escalating the theft. Celeste turned it back on Roland, called him what he was, a man too spineless and too lazy to build anything legitimate, who had let his own son become a criminal because it was easier than working. They had nothing to sustain them but each other's contempt. They became roommates in the worst possible sense, bound by poverty, corroded by blame, unable to escape. The son gone, the money gone, the people who had pretended to be their friends, long gone. Just the two of them in the cold and the walls and the knowledge of what they had thrown away chasing things they never earned. The lesson arrived slowly, the way all the worst lessons do. You cannot build a life that lasts on a foundation of fraud and cruelty. You cannot mistake a quiet man's decency for weakness and expect there to be no reckoning. The ruin they inhabited was not an accident or bad luck. It was the precise and proportionate output of every choice they had made. No hidden money was coming. No old friend was going to surface with a lifeline. What was done, and it was permanent. They would spend whatever years remained waking to that same peeling ceiling, that same rattling refrigerator, that same bill on the table. They couldn't pay a life perfectly sized to the emptiness of what they actually were. Dawn was still just a suggestion on the horizon when I settled onto the front steps of my porch. Both hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug, I let the warmth seep into my palms. These steps had known 40 years of weather, sun, and frost, and rain, and they showed every year of it beneath me. The coffee was the cheap, strong kind I had always preferred, brewed the same way I'd been brewing it for 4 decades. I raised the mug and drank. The sky above the street shifted from dark to pale gray to something almost blue. Slowly, the neighborhood came back to life around me. Mrs. Gable crossed with her golden retriever, bundled in her wool coat against the chill. The delivery truck made its corner tires quiet on wet pavement. Ordinary. Completely, beautifully ordinary. Nobody glancing at me on that weathered porch in my thick canvas work shirt would have guessed for a second at the scale of what I owned, and I had every intention of keeping it that way. The screen door let out its familiar squeak behind me. Nora came out onto the porch. She had on an oversized knitted sweater and carried her own steaming mug. She didn't say a word. She just padded down the steps and settled beside me, drawing her knees up to her chest. I looked at my daughter. The dark bruising under her eyes that had lingered for months had cleared completely. The tight, coiled tension that had gripped her shoulders throughout her miserable years with Derek was gone without a trace. She looked rested. She looked healthy. More than anything else, she looked like herself again, fully at peace. We sat shoulder to shoulder in the cool morning air and watched the street slowly come alive around us. Neither of us felt any need to fill the quiet with words. The silence between us no longer carried the weight of secrets or unspoken dread. It was warm and easy now, anchored in honesty and a trust we had put back together piece by piece. Nora tilted her head onto my shoulder. I drew my arm around her. Over the past 6 months, she had moved back into her old bedroom down the hall. We had logged more hours than I could count at the kitchen table, talking through what had happened and slowly rebuilding what Derek had worked so hard to break. She had asked me once, not long after the trial concluded, why I had no interest in moving. She had seen enough of the financial picture by then to understand the options. I could have bought a sprawling estate in whatever zip code I chose, a private jet, a fleet of cars. I gave her the same answer I had always given myself. A house is wood and glass and concrete. A home is something else entirely. It's a living record of the people who passed through it. I built this place with my own hands. I carried her mother across the threshold. Every summer until Nora left for college, I marked her height on the doorframe in the kitchen. No sum of money buys that kind of accumulated memory. Trading this for some hollow, echoing mansion would not improve my life by a single degree. It would only erase the real, grounded world I had spent decades building on purpose. The wealth was no longer something I had to conceal like a liability. It had gone back to being what it was always meant to be, a tool, nothing more. Back inside the glass tower of Apex Innovations, everything had changed. The poisonous culture Derek had cultivated, the backstabbing, the greed, the ruthless self-interest, had been rooted out entirely. Malcolm and I had taken our time putting together a new executive board, choosing people who understood that lasting success and ethical conduct were not in opposition. The company was healthy again. Revenue was climbing, and not a dollar of it was being bled off into phantom accounts to subsidize anyone's stolen luxury. Profits were going back into the workforce and into the future of the business. I had no need to occupy the corner office to know the ship was holding course. Malcolm managed the day-to-day mechanics of the blind trust with his usual sharp precision. I stayed where I had always been most comfortable, behind the curtain, the majority shareholder shaping direction without needing to stand in the spotlight. The billions in those protected accounts were no longer a secret I guarded with constant vigilance. They had become something quieter and more durable, a fortress. I had put an airtight legal structure in place to make certain Nora would be insulated from whatever the world might attempt. The money would not define who she was. It would not serve as bait for the next Derek who came along with a calculated smile. It would simply exist in the background, invisible and impenetrable, a buffer against hardship she would hopefully never need. She was working part-time at a community center in the neighborhood. Genuinely useful work, the kind that gives you something back. She was figuring out who she was when nobody was controlling her, and the blinding pressure of high society wasn't bearing down on her from all sides. She was learning slowly and surely that what you are worth has nothing to do with what label is stitched into your coat. The sun broke the horizon at last. Gold and orange poured across the lawns of the street, catching the dew on the grass and turning each droplet into a tiny, scattered point of light. A soft breeze moved through the branches of the oak tree in the front yard. I took another pull of my cheap, bitter coffee. Something deep in my chest settled into place, something I hadn't felt in a very long time. The war was over. Not recent history, distant now receding. The people who had come from my family, who had calculated that we could be taken apart and picked over, were waking up this same morning to the weight of what they had chosen. Prison cots, drafty rooms, bills they couldn't pay, the inescapable arithmetic of their own greed compounding daily. But on this old wooden porch there was none of that. There was only stillness and safety and the sound of the neighborhood breathing back to life. I looked out at the quiet street, then down at Nora, resting against my side. It came to me clearly the way simple truths sometimes do when you stop moving long enough to hear them. The real victory was never the public reckoning in that ballroom, and it was never the restoration of the company or the reclaiming of the empire. It was this: a quiet morning, a cup of coffee, my daughter beside me. The founder of Apex Innovations had no desire for a bespoke suit or a room full of people watching him with fear. He was perfectly content in a thick canvas work shirt, drinking from a chipped mug on a porch he built with his own hands. That morning on the porch with Nora beside me and a cup of cheap coffee in my hands, I felt something I had not felt in a very long time: peace. Real, earned, unshakable peace. This road cost me years of silence. It cost me the simple pleasure of being known for who I actually was. I watched people I loved get hurt before the moment was right to act. That is not a small thing to carry. But I believe God does not waste suffering, not a single day of it. The patience I was forced to build, the restraint I had to practice, when every instinct told me to act, became the very instruments of justice. Nothing that happened in that ballroom was an accident. It was the result of years of quiet, deliberate preparation. Here is what I took away from all of it, and what I hope you will carry with you. Never confuse a quiet man for a weak one. Stillness and capability are not opposites. If someone is stealing from you, stop confronting, start documenting. Evidence is the only language a courtroom speaks. Protect the people you love, not just with your words, but with the structures you build around them before the threat arrives. And if you are ever tempted to look down on someone because of what they wear or where they work, think twice. You do not know what they are holding. If this story moved you, I would love to read your thoughts in the comments below. Share it with someone who might need a reminder today that patience and integrity are never wasted. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Family Revenge. There are more stories like this one waiting for you. Thank you for spending this time with me. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next one.